video, we're going to be looking at aggregate supply. This is going to be the production or supply of all goods and services in the economy. So just like aggregate demand, it refers to a national economy, not necessarily an individual product. Then at the end, we're going to be discussing our market equilibrium. We'll be putting aggregate supply and demand together to find out what real GDP is going to be produced. The aggregate supply curve can be vertical, horizontal, or upward sloping. In our graph here, it starts out with a horizontal aggregate supply curve, then it begins to slope upward, and then finally we get this vertical portion of our aggregate supply curve. Each different section here represents a different time frame or time period or something different going on in our economy. In the short run, we would say that aggregate supply is upward sloping, just like all of the other aggregate or regular supply curves we've talked about in chapters 3 and 4 and other markets. As prices go up, our suppliers are willing to produce more. Prices go down, they're willing to produce less. So normal upward sloping supply curve in the short run. Prices are going to affect the quantity supplied. In the long run, aggregate supply becomes vertical because it's no longer affected by the price level, but it's determined by the capital stock, the amount of natural resources available, the amount of labor, and the skills of workers. Our long-run aggregate supply represents potential GDP, represents producing on that production possibility curve. And so in the long run, we're going to have a vertical aggregate supply curve. When the economy is producing really far below potential GDP, at some sort of inefficient point, maybe we have a recession or even the Great Depression, we're going to have an aggregate supply curve that's actually horizontal. This means we have a lot of excess capacity for production, lots of resources laying around, lots of machinery being unused, lots of labor that's available for work but not being productive. And so depending on what's going on in the economy, we're talking short run, long run, are we in a recession, are we producing at potential GDP, we're going to see some very different effects in the market when we have shifts in our aggregate demand. Input costs and output prices are going to affect the supply curve, but we say that these things are fixed in the short run. So the price of production or the cost of production is not going to change in the immediate short run, but in the long run, everything is going to be flexible. And so we're going to see how fixed versus flexible prices are also going to impact our supply and potentially our market equilibrium. When we're looking at short run versus long run, we see that long run is going to be vertical. So there's this purple line right here represents long run aggregate supply. So that's a terrible line I just drew. Okay, long run aggregate supply. It's just going to be a vertical, just a completely vertical line. It's going to say LRAS, long run aggregate supply. And that represents the economy's potential GDP, long run potential GDP, or the full employment level of GDP. Short run, we're going to have this upward sloping supply curve. So that's going to be SRAS, short run aggregate supply. So we're going to have an upward sloping line. And you can see that our short run aggregate supply can actually cross through the long run aggregate supply, meaning sometimes we can actually be producing a little bit beyond our potential GDP. The result of this is we're probably going to have a lot of inflation. There's also a difference in time period. So the short run of today is the long run of tomorrow. So we might be in the long run today of the short run in the past. So you can simultaneously have short run and long run happening at the same time. In the immediate short run, we're going to say that prices are sticky and aggregate demand shifts will only change real GDP and not the price level. But it gets a little bit tricky, right? When economists, when politicians are trying to predict what's going to happen when they try to tamp down inflation, when they try to stimulate the economy to prevent a recession because of COVID, they're kind of guessing. They're saying, which part of this graph are we on? Are we at full potential? Are we below full potential? Is this going to cause inflation? Can we increase production without causing prices to go up? And a lot of times they don't know, and sometimes they guess wrong, or they overshoot things and potentially cause some other problems. Now, if we go back to this last slide, where we have all three of these portions of the graph on the same line, it starts out horizontal, then becomes upward sloping, and then vertical. This is referred to as modern Keynesian theory. It used to be that classical economists just thought we were always at long-run potential. They assumed that prices could just go up and down, and we could always just be staying at our full potential. If demand goes up, prices go up, you could still keep producing there. Demand goes down, you just drop prices, and then that's going to keep you producing at that same level. Then during the Great Depression, an economist named Keynes realized, oh, actually, we're far below the potential. We could just pay people to dig holes and not do anything. It's not going to cause prices to go up. We have this, excess capacity of workers in the market, and we can significantly increase demand without causing inflation. And this curve that sort of combines everything into one graph, this is more of a modern Keynesian approach, where we want to mix some of those Keynesian ideas and classical ideas together. So sometimes, yes, the economy is producing at its full potential, and sometimes it's not. And we have to really think about where we are to figure out if we're going to have effective government policies in trying to regulate the economy. So a lot of the graphs we're going to see in your book and in the rest of the chapters, we're going to have short-run supply be a different line than our long-run supply. Long run is going to be fixed. Anytime it shifts outward or goes to the right means we have some sort of economic growth. We've increased our capacity. And then the short-run aggregate supply is really going to represent what's going on right now in our current time period, independent of whatever our potential GDP is. Now let's look at some of the determinants of aggregate supply. These are going to be some things that can actually shift the aggregate supply curve to the right or to the left. So input prices. This is going to affect the cost of production. This can be domestic resource prices or the imported resource prices. So we're talking about land, labor, and capital. These things are subject to changes in exchange rates if we're buying them from foreign countries. Input prices are going to have an immediate effect on our short-run aggregate supply. If land or labor or capital become more expensive, in the short run, that's going to shift aggregate supply to the left. If it becomes cheaper, it's going to shift aggregate supply to the right. In the long run, input prices don't tend to affect our potential GDP as much because the sale price of the product can also just adjust. And any increases in the price of land, labor, or capital can then be translated into increased sales price of the product and therefore not necessarily affecting production. Productivity or output per worker or hour of work can affect both our long run and short run aggregate supply curves. Increased productivity means we can make more stuff per hour. It's cheaper to produce things. This is going to increase aggregate supply. It's going to shift it to the right. Decreased productivity or increased cost for firms, this is going to cause aggregate demand or aggregate supply to shift to the left. As we become more and more productive, this can lead to more economic growth and more shifting of our potential GDP. We can produce more stuff with the resources available. Likewise, it shifts that aggregate supply curve in the short run. More productivity means we can produce more stuff right away. Government intervention can also shift aggregate supply. Through industry regulations and taxes and subsidies, it changes the expense of production. It changes the things that are possible. Stricter regulations are more expensive. They're going to shift aggregate supply to the left. Reducing regulations, opening up an industry is going to increase aggregate supply. It's going to shift it to the right. Taxes. More taxes means less supply. Right? Less taxes, more supply. They move in opposite directions. A subsidy is the opposite of a tax. So a tax is when the government takes money from companies A subsidy is when the government gives companies money. And so if the government is subsidizing firms, subsidizing production, that's going to increase aggregate supply. Prices and wages don't easily adjust. They don't change continuously. Even if supply and demand are changing on a regular basis, prices and wages don't change continuously, unless you're talking about gas station prices. Partly because labor contracts have some sort of fixed nominal wage. Maybe you have a contract for a year or a month or 5 years, but wages don't really change daily. Usually you know how much you're going to be making and it's set for a specific amount of time. There's also minimum wages, so wages can't drop below a certain level. Prices go down, the market's changing a lot. They can't just adjust everyone's wages down. Typically, some people will be laid off, everyone else's wages will stay the same. There's also approved contracts or negotiated salaries. When you take a job, you sign a contract. You say, yes, I accept this amount of money, or you negotiate for it. Maybe they offer you a certain salary and you say, nope, I want a little bit more. And so salaries are negotiated. They're not things that can easily change, and especially not change downward. The negotiating process is costly. Often it happens once per year. Or there are COLA raises, which COLA means cost of living adjustment. That's often tied to inflation. So there's a requirement for some employers to actually pay you more money every year because of inflation. There's also the issue with nominal price stickiness. There's catalog cost, expectations of customers, and it's not feasible or cost effective to be changing prices every single day. Catalog prices refers to the actual printed prices of products. So whether that's a physical catalog, whether that is a printed menu at a restaurant, a large sign displaying the prices, or printed tags at the store, it's going to cost a company money to change its prices. They're going to have a labor cost of going around changing all the prices. They're going to have supplies costs for putting new stickers on everything or printing new menus. And so they don't want to be changing prices every day. It's really, really expensive. Customers also expect prices to stay the same for relatively long periods of time. Maybe you're okay with prices going up sometimes, but if you walked into Starbucks and you had no idea how much it was going to cost every day, you might quit going. Or any store, right? If you're not sure how much it's going to cost, you might not go. It could be $10 more today. It could be $3 less. Customers don't like uncertainty. They like predictability. And so prices and wages don't change often. And so this can cause some interesting dynamics in our markets, especially when we're trying to stay at that full or potential GDP. When prices and wages can't adjust easily, it's really difficult to stay at full GDP. Because as aggregate demand changes, if prices stay the same, then that means real GDP is going to need to change. When we put aggregate demand and aggregate supply together, then we're going to get a market equilibrium. So as we saw on our graph before, we can have our short-run aggregate supply, aggregate demand. Over here we have the price level, and down here we've got real GDP. Now somewhere we're also going to have our long-run aggregate supply. When we're talking about our market equilibrium, it's always going to be where our short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand intersect. So we can also have our long-run aggregate supply. Let's put that right here. But the equilibrium is going to be in the short run. This is going to be where you have a particular price level and a quantity or a value of real GDP that's the same for both the supply and demand. We can look at that on this table as well. So we're going to have some different price levels. So here we're going from 0.5 all the way to 1.5. And then we have our aggregate quantity of goods and services both demanded and supplied. So this is aggregate demand, this is aggregate supply. And basically what you want to do is you want to find where these two values are the same at a particular price level. So at a price level of 0.75, we get aggregate demand of 2,000 and aggregate supply of 2,000. Price level of 0.5, we have demand of 2,500, supply of 1,500. Or price of 1.5, we have demand of 500, supply of 2,600. And so our equilibrium is going to be the point where these two things agree. Now on this particular graph that I've drawn, our short run equilibrium is going to be below long run. It's going to be below that long run aggregate supply, or below potential GDP. This would actually mean the economy is in some sort of a recession, potentially. We're producing below or some inefficient level. If we were at a point in this economy, let's say 2000 was our long run aggregate supply, then all three of these lines would intersect to show our equilibrium. We'd be producing at potential GDP. That would mean there's no cyclical unemployment. We're not in a business cycle recession. So if all three are intersecting, you can have that type of equilibrium. Otherwise, if long run is somewhere else, then your equilibrium is always where short run aggregate supply and real GDP intersect. Sometimes we may be producing a little bit beyond that potential GDP, and that's going to cause inflation. Similar to what we saw in 2022, there was very low unemployment. There was lots of demand for products and services, and we saw prices go quite high. We're going to continue looking at these models over the next few chapters. We're going to talk about economic growth more. We're going to talk about aggregate expenditures model, fiscal and monetary policy, and all of those things are really going to be related to aggregate demand and real GDP and that equilibrium. In this graph, or this table, we will say that this economy has a potential GDP of 1,500, and the aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply are shown on the table. So we can draw these curves, okay, as I did a little bit earlier. I'm going to draw a small one here now. So short-run aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and they're at an equilibrium of 2,000. And then if our potential GDP is at 1,500, we would put that over here. Now suppose aggregate demand increases by $800. What is our new equilibrium? So how we figure that out is by taking our aggregate demand and just adding $800 at every level. So here we would get 3,300, and then 2,800, and then 2,300, 1,800, and 1,300. Okay, so when you have a table and aggregate demand is increasing by a certain value, you just add that value to each spot. Okay, so aggregate demand, that would be represented in the graph here with a shift to the right at a new equilibrium of $2,300. So price level of 1 and real GDP of 2,300. So take a look at this, practice. There's some in your homework as well, and let me know what questions you have. And we will continue to talk about this over the next several chapters of the semester.